last session, a little bit more than I was expecting. I appreciate everyone not taking the early flight this morning and going back home. So today we're going to talk about ERM, Enterprise Risk Management, in healthcare. I guess before I start with that, I should tell you who I am. The last time I presented in front of an audience like this, I got about 2/3 of the way into it and realized I didn't say who I was. So this time I made a note to myself. So my name is Robert Stratton. I'm a lawyer. I have an MBA, which I think is important here because ERM brings together finance and economics along with strategy and law compliance to one unified discipline. I work for Kaiser Permanente, at least I work for a medical group in the Northwest, part of the Kaiser Permanente system. Kaiser is the second largest healthcare company, integrated healthcare in the country. 13 million members, so it's like 6% of the US population, something like that, for healthcare, or Kaiser Permanente members. I live in Portland and Chief Compliance Officer for the medical group in Oregon and Southwest Washington, where we're located in compliance with those state-specific laws. So, what is ERM, if you haven't heard about it? ERM is a lot of it's like what typical compliance is, but instead of only focusing on being compliant with law and regulation and internal policies, ERM takes a broad view and looks at risks and opportunities in the whole company and tries to connect the dots. So we integrate strategy and corporate governance a lot more than traditional compliance does. And also I wanted to mention, I used AI to make this PowerPoint. Maybe you already could figure that out. It looks like this first slide looks like an AI slide. Like the word architecting, I don't ever use the word architecting, but Gemini thought it sounded good. I only mention that because I wish I hadn't used AI because it was a lot harder and took a lot longer than I did it myself. But in the end, it came up with some really interesting graphics, so I went with it. But there are a couple of areas where it's a little wonky. If I remember, I'll try to point those out just to make sure we're very clear on a couple of points. Oh, also, I love questions. Anytime. Feel free to interrupt me if you have a question about what I'm currently talking about. I think all these mics are live. Okay, so VUCA. VUCA has gained a lot of popularity as a term, especially coming out of COVID and then the regulatory shifting for the last 18 months or so. It's a concept that was coined by Army General Maxwell Thurman, then some other academics put a lot more work into it. But it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And these are major failure points when waging war, but also when running a company. I have this in here because at its core, what an ERM framework does is go to these 4 issues. And I think it does it better than some of the work I've seen on VUCA as far as how to apply to business, even though a lot of boards, a lot of the term VUCA, the actual work out there I've seen doesn't actually show how to solve it. It has concepts like, well, if you have uncertainty, find clarity, but how do you find that in a large, complex business? So these ERM principles are a way to get to that, to navigate things like COVID or HHS that is completely unpredictable. So I'm sure you've seen this. I mean, every HCCA conference I've been to has somebody talking about how there's a change in compliance from siloed reactive to proactive. And enterprise risk management concepts, when applied into compliance, really go to this. The whole idea of ERM is to have lots of data and have lots of tools available to the whole company to use that data to apply it to think strategically. So, in my own experience, I was brought into my current company to build an ERM system, and then when the chief compliance officer left, they said, hey Rob, why don't you take your ERM stuff and rework compliance program with license contents. And it fit so well, in part because I was asked to think differently about audit and compliance. Okay, so let's start at the top. I was brought in to build the ERM system because my board wanted it. One of the directors was at a conference and heard how wonderful ERM is, and said, why don't we have it? So I was brought in. So let's start with the board. So every corporate board, and there's very similar duties in nonprofits with board of trustees, has two main fiduciary duties. There's a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. So the duty of care is essentially, you gotta be competent. Right? You have to know the basics of how the company works, how finances work, if you're gonna be on a board and have that oversight duty. And the duty of loyalty is don't be sleazy. You're there to work for the company, not to take opportunities of that company. And then there's this kind of third sub-duty, duty of obedience, which is ensuring the organization is adhering to law. And I'm going to get to this on the next slide, but these duties are ever evolving, and they've evolved pretty dramatically over the last few years through corporate law. To be much more defined. So the care mark duty is the base of the evolution that supports an ERM and supports a more robust compliance function. And the care mark duty has evolved in corporate law. Actually back to the 1960s. So one of the first cases around fiduciary duty comes from the 60s, where the courts decided that boards don't have to go actively looking for problems. If they're aware of a problem, they need to take care of it. They need to make sure that management's taking care of it. So essentially, if you see the iceberg, you got to get it out of the way, but you don't have to go looking for icebergs. And then in 1996, there was a Caremark case where the court then concluded that it's not good enough to not go looking for cases. The board has to make sure the company has risk management systems that are looking for the icebergs. And the bar for that was really low. Essentially, the cases that brought up this were so pretty egregious, like a board that didn't have a CFO. They had no one looking over their finances. So they weren't even aware if they were stealing money or if they were negative in their bank accounts. And another case, the board, there was no evidence the board actually talked about the business in the meetings. They talked about golfing, talked about their weekend plans, never once talked about the business. So these are pretty egregious cases. So that's where this standard comes from. It was further expanded with Stone v. Ritter, which further defined as a two-pronged test for Caremark. Both prongs require good faith, but it's essentially that you have to have systems in place to monitor for risk, and you have to actually monitor those systems. So you have to have a CFO that's looking for financial risk, and you have to listen to that CFO when she comes to talk to you. So for the next 10 or 13 years, Caremark was famously defined as the hardest legal theory to get a judgment on in court. The bar was so high for a Caremark case that they were almost always dismissed. And then Bluebell Creameries in Texas, and if anybody's from Texas, you probably know Bluebell ice cream. I lived in Texas, and it was one of my favorite ice creams. It started having problems at two of their manufacturing plants with listeria contamination. And management had a plan, and they actually ended up taking care of the listeria contamination. Unfortunately, not before 2 people died, and lots of people got sick. But they had a mitigation plan. The problem is, there was no evidence at the board level that anybody ever informed the board that they had listeria contamination or a management plan, and the board never asked. They were too busy talking about the profits they were making. And this particular board was made up of several insiders. The chair was a CEO, so there was some undue influence. closely held company. So there was some other issues. But the thing is, the court was outraged that people died in the board just to care about their stock buybacks. So they expanded the Caremark case for the first time in 13 years, and actually held that board personally responsible. So the company was responsible. The company had to pay out damages. They held them responsible for the shareholder, the loss of shareholder value, not to the victims of the listeria contamination. But they also said, you guys screwed up so bad, you're going to have to pay out your pocket too, which was pretty new development in corporate law. So then that started off a wave of development of these cases. And I wrote it down and I moved my notes, so I want to make sure I get the order right. So the next case was Clovis. Henry Clovis, where a pharmaceutical company was developing a new medicine. And they're about to go public with it, about to put it out there, about to make a lot of money, and the board was just focused on how much money they're going to make. And they were getting reports, though, the latest safety data coming in showing that there's some adverse effects on the human test subjects. But they didn't listen to it. So they had the first step. They had systems in place to monitor risk. They were monitoring the safety, but they were not heeding it. So the court opinion came back, and when you read the court opinion, it's pretty funny actually, because it starts in the beginning with the board listened with hands on their ears to muffle the alarms. So you know when you read something like that, the judgment, the case is not going to go well for them. And lo and behold, came out against them. And what that expansion was that you have to actively monitor in good faith and not cover your ears. And then that set up a further wave, and the expansion, I won't go into all the cases, although they're all really interesting. Like the 737 MAX disaster was one of the Caremark expansions. A couple of other ones you've heard of, but essentially it's expanded to not monitoring as an act of bad faith. Expanded to committees have the same oversight duty. So if you're an audit committee, you have the same oversight duty now to have systems in place over related audit functions, but you don't have to go over other functions. It required to acquisitions. So both companies in an acquisition, the one being acquired and the one acquiring, have to be aware of the other's risks and monitor those risks during that process. Direct and indirect subsidies. So the parent company is now responsible for monitoring risk and subsidies and indirect subsidies. And then the last kind of big one came from McDonald's. So McDonald's is having this problem with rampant sexual harassment, including the CEO and the chief people officer were accused of sexual harassment of subordinates. And there was lots of reports coming into the chief people officer, but he didn't really have a system in place, probably because he was part of it, to kind of monitor and report that up. And it was pretty egregious, again, rampant sexual harassment with leaders also being accused of it. So the court came back and said, well, that's it. Officers now have the same duty. So officers can be held personally liable, and they're also acting in bad faith with their jobs if they aren't actually monitoring risk and reporting it up in their silos. Okay, so Caremark went from the hardest legal theory to prosecute in court to suddenly every company was getting caught up with this with big financial penalties. And the court came back and said, maybe we went a little too far, and they started pulling back a little bit. And now the latest cases come out, and they're saying that for, especially for officers, everyday business problems are not bad faith. They're everyday business problems. It's the business judgment. Of course, don't want to go back and say, we look at the facts, they weren't there. The business can handle its business. This is about governance. So everyday business problems, if they go bad, that doesn't mean you're governing your life. And then they also came back and said with directors that directors are not detectives. So yes, they have to make sure the management is monitoring the big risks, and they have to listen, but they don't need to go out there, and find the problems. So they have a management team for it. So they pulled back a little bit, but you still have to, the lesson is, companies still have to have risk management. And at its core, compliance is a risk management function, and enterprise risk management, the broader risks are also risk management functions, so it's the most natural place for this fiduciary duty to take place. Okay, so another evolution is the DOJ. I'm sure a lot of you are not all of you are aware of the DOJ guidance on effective compliance programs. But they started changing their tune about compliance in 2020 with several guidance opinions put out there, saying that compliance is, I'm paraphrasing here, compliance is too complicated these days. Businesses are too complicated. The compliance department can't monitor every compliance risk, so you need to use risk assessments and risk principles to prioritize and monitor the ones that are most serious and dedicate the most resources to those. With the latest guidance in 2024, and I checked last night to make sure that our current DOJ is still promoting this guidance, actually calls out ERM specifically, so not just risk management, but enterprise risk management. It calls out the context of AI. So AI compliance must be connected to the broader ERM work. And so what does that matter? Well, it matters because the DOJ can go after companies civilly and they can go after criminally. And where they go after criminally? Well, they go after healthcare companies because we deal with federal money, we deal with humans and lives. So we're more likely to have a criminal or any DOJ action. And whether they are going to work with you or throw the book at you is going to be determined by how much of this guidance you followed. So here's a list of how ERM satisfies DOJ criteria. Okay. And I don't have this slide in here for the OIG, but the OIG has also had some guidance opinions that follow or supported by ERM-based systems. Okay. So how do you go about? So that was why companies or healthcare organizations should embrace ERM. So here's how you do it. So there's a COSO ERM framework, which is one of the big ones. So this is a framework to integrate risk with strategy and performance. It's pretty good. Used quite a bit. Most of the last update 2017. There's an ISO 3100. I'm sure I've ISO before, the National Standards Organization, I believe. So they published 3100, 31,000, which complements 27,000, but this is specifically for ERM, flexible civil. But this is not for healthcare, right? And that kind of is the third one here. Casualty Actuarial Society has their own framework, but it's really more for healthcare, insurance, and financial companies. So I don't recommend actually using these frameworks because they're for a wide variety of companies, very broad. But I think everyone should be pulling the concepts into your own and pulling what works out of this to fit your own needs. Okay. So how do you, that's another thing I forgot to mention. So if you're wanting to know how to build an ERM system, you can pick up the HCCA governance manual, last published 2025, and there's a section in there called ERM for Healthcare, and I wrote it. And all this material is from that. So if you want to learn more, you can pick that up and get more details. So here's how I would build a system now. The foundation of it. So I would look at the history and industry specifics. So we're healthcare compliance. So in healthcare, it's pretty unique. So ERM as a discipline comes from the financial industry. It was being developed in the financial industry last 25 years, insurance and banks. And what really got the boost was, well, I mean, of course, the disasters of the early aughts, Enron, at that time there was promotion that ERM principles would have helped prevent those disasters. But then the 2008 crash, the response to that by the government, the Dodd-Frank Act. And the Dodd-Frank Act actually makes it law for banks and certain financial industries to follow ERM principles. So just overnight, all these companies started investing in all this. And in fact, that's how I got into ERM, is I was practicing law in a very finance-forward way, with venture capital and finance related, and learned about ERM and just kind of loved the concepts here. And in fact, up until recently, every person that I know, my counterparts ahead of ERM, were all from the finance industry. The problem is the finance industry is not healthcare. You would think they're both healthcare regulated, but talk to a banker and then talk to a doctor, and they don't speak the same language at all. So adapting ERM principles like the previous frameworks to healthcare is challenging. And yeah, there's some examples like doctors and medical professionals have their own ethical obligations. So patient safety. How do you prioritize and compare risk against patient safety to profits and loss? And they're two separate things, and I don't think anybody would say that one takes precedent over the other. Medical professionals, especially in healthcare, and those doctors, I say this because I love them, and I work with 1,700 of them, and they have a very unique way of thinking. You're trained in medical school and other professional healthcare to think a certain way. Not the same way you do in the finance industry. So you have to get over that obstacle of understanding the priorities and thought processes. So the second thing is, for ERM, once you understand what problems in the industry you have and are trying to overcome, is you have to have a systematic data collection. It all hinges on data. Then you have to understand what your strategic decision framework is. Because the data is useless if you don't understand what the strategy of the company is. And then you also have to have a top-down driven risk culture. And why top-down? Because it has to come from the board. The board is ultimately responsible for the risks and opportunities of the company. And what we're talking about is empowering the whole company, management down the front line, to make decisions based on what the company's strategy and risk tolerances are. And only the board, along with management, can determine how much risk the company wants to take at a macro level. So, once you understand your industry, your specifics on your company, then you figure out how to collect data. Then you decide what your risk acceptance and appetites and tolerances and your philosophies, which has to come from the board. And then you figure out how to adapt all that to a risk-aware culture so that your company can take advantage of it. Okay. So getting started. So I bet most of you in your companies already have a lot of this, as the word architecture again, for Jim and I. But you already have all these systems. You probably have laws in place to assess risk assessments in compliance programs in other areas. So a system-wide ERM program probably should be built on existing programs because people will be familiar with them. Why start over? You have to define the program objectives. In my own experience, this is critical because half the people I deal with at work don't have any idea what ERM is and don't understand the problem we're trying to solve. And so without clear objectives of what you're doing, you don't get money. And you have to assess the cultural readiness. ERM requires, it's all based on culture. All the data and the strategy statements are meaningless if the culture can't support it. And I think this is the hardest step. So you have to assess where your internal culture is. And then you have to secure the mandate, because again, this is top-down driven. This is not something you do grassroots building up support. So you have to get your management team and your board to understand what you're doing and mandate the work. Okay. So, like I said, half the people I deal with have no idea what I'm doing in the beginning and why I'm doing it. So, standard thing is when in any business program is how to get support, how to deal with detractors, and it's extremely important here. Extremely important because I've just said you're dealing with your board and you're dealing with your executive team. And if your CFO supports what you're doing, it's going to be a lot easier than if they're actively working against you. So that's an active detractor. And active detractors don't like ERM because it requires a lot of transparency. And also, it appears that you're building a framework that lowers their authority. You start having things about here's what non-risk you can do and the steps you need to do and how you have to report. That's scary. You combine that with that you have to report and have your people underneath you report risks and failures. That can feel that it's personal. So on the promoter side, I was really lucky, so I'll tell you a little story about my work. Like I said, in 2017 or 16 or so, one of the board directors went to a conference and was like, I want to do this. And it took him a couple of years to get enough support to move forward. And then they hired me. And didn't give me a mandate. They just said, hey, we want something, you figure it out. So I had complete freedom. And we feel it was pretty good because I came back with something that I got support for. And I had complete board support. Before I had it, even before the CEO would give me a yes or no, the board said, we want this, we voted on it. So I had complete board support. But as you can imagine, going to senior level, officer level, and saying, yeah, the board told me to do this, that doesn't go over well. You don't have their support. So I had some pretty active detractors from the start that had to understand what we're doing. And that even when they're not active, the passive can derail progress because the first enterprise risk assessment, which we'll get to in a second here, came back with looking like some departments had a lot of risk and some departments had none. Well, why is that? Well, because when we were interviewing the departments, some departments said, yes, this is a problem, this is what this is going to go wrong, and other departments wouldn't provide information. So our first risk register, which we're going to get to in a minute, showed a lot of risks in those friendly departments and no risks. So that skews the data. Transparency is really scary in certain companies, and I think it's even more in healthcare. And I'm sure we're all in different areas of healthcare. But I'm in an integrated system, so we're doctors and insurance and the hospital administration is one. And there's a tendency in those kind of very complex environments where people hold on to their own power because there's a perceived power imbalance, say, with doctors. Doctors have more authority in a healthcare company often. So non-doctors, in my experience, want to level up to their authority when it comes to doctors. And then doctors often don't know the business side, so they're nervous to be transparent, and then they're not as confident in their business knowledge. So they just shut down. And that doesn't work unless you really overcome. Okay. So, enterprise risk assessment. Well, the first thing is you do is collect data, and then you do it again over and over and over and over again. But we're talking about the whole enterprise. And each department wasn't taught the same language. So, as you're capturing an inventory, it's important that you're able to express and capture all these different areas. And since no one talks the same language, it's hard to identify. You have to identify what the risk is and how severe that risk is. So to overcome this, there's a case study here from Stanford Medicine that they created this 28 risk taxonomy to ensure this cross-departmental communication. That's a lot, but we're talking about Stanford Medicine, so it's very broad what they're doing because they're teaching, they're practicing medicine, they're research publications, IP issues. So the 28 risk taxonomy makes sense. I've identified 10 that are pretty common here, areas to focus on. In my own program back at the company, we have closer to 17 functional areas in our taxonomy. So I guess it depends on the complexity of the company. But having that Rosetta Stone of a common language is absolutely critical. Okay, so one more thing on this. So your ERA is going to have to be done in the beginning. And you're probably going to have risk assessments following your compliance department, other areas, or individual, but this is again across the whole company. And it's to capture the baseline. And then should be done probably at a cadence of once a year. But doing a full interviewing the whole company or the whole management team and a couple layers down in management once a year, it's a big overtaking. I split it up into a couple different ways, but I interview each department once a year, but at a pace throughout the year. And what I do is every time a department comes to my enterprise risk management board oversight committee, I take that opportunity to do a risk assessment of just that department there. So that it's not as disruptive. But you need this data on a good cadence. So what do you do with the data? Well, one of the best tools is this. It's a standard tool in ERM, and I'm sure it's a standard tool, but just a heat map. This goes to my board. This is one of the slides that the reason why I decided to not throw AI is because I love how it did this because it allows me to illustrate what a heat map is, but then also put the examples that I have, I'm going to talk about it later, and it shows where to go on the heat map. But this is what would go to your board or to your compliance or your annual oversight committee, and it's pulling the data about what the risk is and where it falls on here. So in the red, it's bad. In the green, don't worry about it. This gets back to DOJ compliance guidelines, or some guidance, because if you have something here on the green and something in the red, you shouldn't be spending much time when you're in the green. You should be working on the red. So on my heat maps, I have one that goes to my board that has something like this, and then I have another one that goes to my ERM oversight committee that has a little bit more information, including where it is, where the risk is inherently. So what we identified, if we didn't do anything about it, how significant it would be. And then we also have it as an estimate now that we have some controls in place where we brought it. So you can see how our work on these risks is affecting the risk level. And then of course you're doing this every year, so then you can get this over time as well and show progress over time either way. Really easy way to look at that standard way to do it. Now here's the examples. So we have an example of Vanderbilt, and I don't know if anybody's heard of this case, but it happened, I think, in Virginia. But there was a medication administered home, and I think there was a casualty or severe injury at the minimum, and the nurse injected the wrong medication. It led to lots of different things, but the conclusion of this was a systematic risk, an enterprise risk. It wasn't just one nurse getting it wrong, although she did. There was a system behind it, and that should have been identified in a risk assessment. So we'll put that over here on this map. It's a high impact. That's a high impact. But the likelihood is fairly low. And the reason why is because we have every healthcare provider has systems in place to minimize medication mishaps. So it is rare that something would build up a systematic risk like this. But on the other hand, you have Change Healthcare. I'm sure if everybody here in healthcare, they were affected by Change Healthcare ransomware breach. So that's high impact. I mean, whole medical practices went out of business because they were so not liquid that a month without their billing, they couldn't survive. So big impact. And the likelihood of these ransomware attacks are going up and up. In the Change Healthcare case, it was amazing that it didn't happen sooner because the hacker found a really obvious vulnerability. We were affected with Change Healthcare in a way that probably wouldn't have been picked up on a normal risk assessment, but I think it would have been picked up on an ERM if we were doing it back then in this area. And that's because everything's so interconnected now. It wasn't just people not getting their billings from Change Healthcare and their payments. They provided to us just public data in an easy format for us to feed into our provider system of record. So this data feed, when they shut down their IT systems, this data feed also got shut down, and it's just a few public pieces of information that it was combined in a way that worked for our system. They had so many downstream impacts, including the Epic for billing, and that it affected us quite dramatically. And so that was a very small, minute way you wouldn't pick up otherwise. We wouldn't have identified that without a more systematic, in-depth look, but had a very long impact for us. We had turned into a manual system. They have Stewart Health. Again, high impact and high likelihood, especially in the time of private equity. So Stewart Health, one of the largest, maybe at a time, the largest hospital system, and they were doing all sorts of wacky things to survive. They were selling their hospitals and leasing it back, and just doing some really crazy things that wasn't obvious to the main practice. These are really tricky financial instruments they were using. And then they had operational collapse. And my connection to Stewart Health is that I was on vacation not too far from here in a Stewart Health hospital getting my appendix out while I was reading the headlines about their collapse. So it didn't give me enough. I was already not impressed with the state of the ER. It felt a little run down. So that was an interesting time for me. So it always sticks out in my head. Okay, so then what do we do? We're in red, we're in green, what do we do? So these are the standard four things like risk management. You can mitigate, you can avoid, you can exit activity altogether, you can accept the risk, and you can transfer the risk out. And transferring is hard in healthcare. Right? It's reputational. Reputation is pretty hard to get over in healthcare because people are trusting in your life. Right? So if they lose their faith in you, they don't come back, they have another option. And there's certain things that can't be transferred. You can't transfer patient safety risk very well. It's good, bad, medical. but there's an ethical obligation. Doctors and nurses have a distinct legal-based ethical obligation. It can't be transferred to anybody. Okay, let's talk about accept. So how do you figure out how to accept? Well, this comes back to this data collection. Because as you're collecting data, you're assessing that risk in a holistic, systematic way, and it becomes a little bit easier to determine what you can accept. Because now you have some kind of factually based assessment of what the real risk is, and what your risk tolerance is. Okay. So I kind of mentioned this earlier. How do you, coming in, there's more of these, but clinical strategy and financial strategy are the biggest two conflicting elements in healthcare. And what ERM does is it allows those two to be with the common language, the common technology, with the systematic rating. It allows you to start comparing those in a way that makes sense. And this is kind of shown by Atrium Health. Atrium Health started a process where every strategic initiative, every business initiative, every side of service kind of change, where you're changing what the clinical offering is, needs to go through a formal ERM-based risk assessment to look at all this. And then that assessment is then used to make a decision. So, at least in the published article, they're saying it's very successful. It changed the way that they've been able to look at clinical strategy and financial strategy. So that risk assessment that we talked about doing on a regular cadence, this is where that information goes into. To a risk register. Again, I'm sure this is not new. I'm sure a lot of you already have risk register. The ERM view of risk register is that you are using this to identify the risk, but also tying it to a strategic goal. Right? So you know where the risk fits in. That's part of your taxonomy is categorizing in a way that fits to a larger strategic goal. And then you also want to inventory your controls and tie it to the risk. And you also want to rate the risk. So severity, how likely, what the outcome would be, the negative outcome would be if the risk comes true, and how likely it is to happen. And that's all on here. Risk registers could be in the tens of thousands of lines, depending on how in depth you want to go. So in a traditional ERM program, you don't go into quite such depth. You're going to have strategy risks, you're going to have external risks, and based on the new Caremark standard of having to monitor operations a little bit more at the board level, you'll have some kind of significant enterprise-wide operational risks. Versus more traditional risk register and compliance, where it's very operational and light on strategy. So again, another area where the compliance and ERM come together quite well is connecting the dots on the ERM focus of strategy and top-level operational risks to the more in-depth ones. Oh, the other thing about risk register, if you're feeling fancy, is that you can also collect information on mitigation steps, corrective action, policies. And that leads with this next slide. There's all these different tools to leverage this. There's a bunch of different vendors that put this. I use one that can connect to my existing systems and pull data, handles like manual input. And the outcome of the one is my system is that I have this interactive heat maps, but I also have a mapping that shows how every policy in my company, what risk and control that policy affects. And then what controls map to what risks and how those controls map to each other. So I get this 3D view of the complete risk universe, but also all our controls and how they affect each other. So the other thing about using technology is that you need lots of data. So technology can help with that. And you need information that comes from people. And people don't like doing things that are tedious or hard. So the easier you can make it for them, the better. So no matter how much data you're collecting from your existing data pool, your databases, you still need to do interviewing, frontline people, interviewing leaders, once a year to get their assessment. And the easier you can make that, the better. So with the system that we end up going with allows people to log in on their own and just walks them through how to do it. It takes 15 minutes. They can assess all their risks. I can meet with them and do it. And that increases the response rate. So then there's this Winona Health example where it was a study on how Winona Health used technology to allow easier reporting. And this wasn't necessarily for ERM risk. This was reporting like compliance and HR issues, but it was really easy to report. And their employees reported a lot more. All that stuff was hidden before. Okay, so this is the meat of ERM, in my opinion. This is the next slide. So I kept talking about how do you connect it to strategy at the board level. Well, I think the best tool is a risk appetite. And I'm sure you've seen a risk appetite before. Almost every public company has some risk appetite statement in their public disclosures to shareholders. That's kind of part of the Dodd-Frank Act, actually. It's not mandated, but it's kind of suggested. But it's normally something kind of vague and academic, and not very helpful for applying. So it's normally something like, because we value our customers, we'll take on a lot of risk to make them happy, but also looking at the bottom line. Well, what does that mean? I don't really know what that means. How does that work in healthcare? So if I have something like that, obviously more tailored to healthcare, how do you take one or two sentences and that tells your chief quality officer how to ensure clinical quality, at the same time tells your chief legal officer how to handle compliance and legal risk? Well, it doesn't. So I actually created in my program 10 different risk appetites that apply to different parts of the organization that inform leaders in that area how they should be evaluating it, and then also informs the other leaders how they're going to compare and prioritize their risks. Turns out 17 is way too many, so we're paring that down to about 10. But the idea is that in a complex organization, risk appetite should be, you have multiple probably. And a risk appetite should literally be, we'll accept this much risk to achieve this goal, and it should be a strategic goal. So it's the high level of strategic planning. But even that is not very helpful operationally, so then often you'll have risk tolerances. And risk tolerances can do a couple different things. Risk tolerances can set up guardrails to inform how much authority management has at certain levels. That's one approach. The other approach is a variance of how much risk we want to accept. So why is that important? Because let's say your risk appetite says we'll accept a medium amount of risk to accomplish a particular goal. And what is a medium amount of risk? Well, they probably have some figures or way to quantify that in your organization. But more importantly, how much variance do you have? Well, you can define that by having at the bottom of the risk tolerance a key risk indicator. So if you hit a certain amount of risk in some metric, a key risk at the top. So if you go above some metric, you're out of the zone. You're way at too much risk. And at the bottom, a KPI. Because what's the opposite of risk? It's opportunity. If you're risk averse, you're opportunity averse. So at the bottom of the tolerance, you would have a KPI. And if you're below that performance indicator, then well, you're too risk averse. Speed up a little bit. And then I think the key of it all, in light of Pairmark, is the standard of materiality. So my board has a standard of materiality which defines what is the purview of the board. So the board is interested in these things. It's the big picture shareholder things. And that sets what's material for the board. So when we talk about operational risk, we don't want our board monitoring operations, but the law says now that they do. They have to make sure that the big stuff is being monitored. So it defines that. And then I have a standard of materiality for my compliance committee, which shows what compliance risks I need to be bringing to them. So standard materiality is some kind of formal framework that tells everyone what goes to the board, what goes to committees, and what's appropriate for management oversight. Again, it goes back to that heat map of what green versus red. And materiality is helping you define what that green versus red is, and being informed by your risk appetite. Okay, I already talked about this, that healthcare really lends itself to multiple risk appetite statements, not just one or two sentences. Okay, the biggest thing in the ERM is this culture. So I think it has to be based on a just culture, meaning where people aren't afraid to speak up. It's not punitive. Formal culture where you speak up and you're not punished. Doesn't mean there's not accountability, but it promotes transparency. So that's just the basis, because from there you have to get to a risk-aware culture. So when you combine what we've already built here, where we have a formal framework of how it supports good decision-making, of how much risk you should be taking, what you should be focusing on by your strategic principles when you go for oversight. When you have that mixed with people that feel psychologically safe enough to report, to make decisions, to apply it, then you have a risk-aware culture, where everyone in the company knows what decisions they should be making and how they should make them. And if they get it wrong, they have the framework to say, this is how I interpret it, and they feel safe telling you when they get it wrong. Okay. So a couple more examples of this in action. Syngent Health turned to a proactive risk model where they identified those positions that were high-risk positions, ones that were likely to make a mistake that would be costly medical malpractice. And by identifying those first and then reaching out to them for coaching, they got away from shotgun type of education where everyone has to get a training, even though really it's a handful of people that need that training. And they got away from training that wasn't appropriate, it wasn't needed. So you can go to the physician and coach them using this proactive method, using the data. And they had an 83% reduction in malpractice claims. And then Discovery Health is a health insurer in South Africa, and they developed this key risk indicator dashboard that even at the board level, that it's in real time, and they're using all these weird data points, like having employees wearing Fitbits, and that's collected as a key risk indicator of how much activity that they're getting out for a walk at lunch instead of sitting around, things like that. That's just one example. They have some other more traditional ones too. And now they have this real-time key risk indicator dashboard. So you can then use that. It's not lagging. It's showing you in real time. It's not a year later you're reporting something to the risk register. It's really quite cool how they did that. And they reported in 2020 that led to the equivalent of savings of $380 million that year that they attributed to the key risk indicator dashboard and a couple other risk-based proactive measures. So in the end, this is how it all comes together. The ERM program should be tying everything together here, where information is flowing up, direction is flowing down, and the company's acting as one enterprise. All right, that's all I have. If somebody has some questions or. I also was told that the questions can come in on the chat here, if you can see there. Yeah.
Do you have recommendations for organizations where really best practices for managing risks occurring in each of the different zones or departments? And then how do you unify that? Like how do you get alignment and buy-in for the what could seem like the overwhelming task of unifying? And what are the benefits that can be made around really benefits of time and energy that when you're doing it with all the departments versus aligning it together?
Yeah, so the question is, if multiple departments have their own way of doing this internally in the department, how do you, what's the benefit of doing it kind of more enterprise systematically? And that's where that top-down comes from. So it does have to come from the board and executive management defining the larger strategic goals and the amount of risk you're willing to take to get to those goals. And then using that along with your common taxonomy to do what you're doing in individual groups. And that's where some of the resistance comes from, because we're already doing this. But often what's happening in individual departments isn't necessarily connected to the strategic goals as much as they think, and also a different process. So what is that risk rating? What are they defining that off of? So if you're defining off an enterprise risk management system, the risks should be normalized, and how you measure that risk should be normalized, versus individual departments doing their own methods. So the why becomes kind of obvious when you start getting more data, but the how has to come from the structure at the top, the framework, getting approval and being put in place first before you start trying to get people to change their ways. Okay, well, if there's no more hold on, we're really glad that so many people stayed and listened to me.